Picture this: a small pair of blue suede shoes lying in a forest clearing 7 miles from civilization. Two hunters stumble upon them and immediately know something is terribly wrong. Children's shoes don't belong in the wilderness. Not here. Not like this. But here's what makes this discovery absolutely bone-chilling. Those shoes had been missing for 16 days. The little girl who wore them had vanished while doing something so innocent, so American, so utterly normal that it should have been impossible for tragedy to strike. She was selling candy door to door for her youth group. When investigators finally followed those shoes to their horrifying conclusion, they uncovered a crime scene that would haunt an entire city for over 6 decades. The killer? He would die taking his secrets to the grave, escaping justice, living a normal life while a mother slowly went insane not knowing who murdered her only child. But here's the twist that nobody saw coming. 63 years later, science would reach back through time itself to expose him. His own DNA, preserved unknowingly on fabric from 1959, would speak from beyond the grave and finally reveal his identity. His own daughter would be the one to help prove he was a monster. This is the story of Candy Rogers. And I promise you, by the end of this investigation, you'll understand why this case is considered one of the most remarkable cold case solutions in American history. Welcome to Buried Secret Media. I'm your host, and today we're uncovering a case so complex, so heartbreaking, and so incredibly resolved that it almost defies belief. Before we dive into this investigation, I need you to do 3 things right now. First, hit that subscribe button because cases like this take serious research and your support makes these deep dives possible. Second, smash that like button so YouTube knows you want more true crime content that actually goes deep. And third, drop a comment below telling me if you've ever heard of the Candy Rogers case before today. I read every single comment, and I want to know what you think about how this case was finally solved. Now, let's begin our journey into one of the darkest chapters in Spokane, Washington's history. Before I tell you what happened to 9-year-old Candy Rogers on March 6, 1959, you need to understand the world she lived in. Because without that context, you won't fully grasp how something this evil could happen in broad daylight on a residential street where neighbors knew each other's names. Spokane, Washington, in the late 1950s was the embodiment of post-war American optimism. The Second World War had been over for 14 years. The economy was booming. Families were moving into newly built suburban neighborhoods with lawns and picket fences. This wasn't just a city, it was a community built on trust. Let me paint you a picture of what life was like in West Central Spokane, where Candy lived. Front doors weren't just unlocked during the day. They were often left wide open to let in the breeze. Children roamed freely through neighborhoods until the streetlights came on. 9-year-olds walked to school alone, rode their bikes without helmets, and played in the woods behind their houses without adult supervision. Parents didn't hover. They didn't track their children with GPS. They trusted their community to protect its youngest members. The Spokane River wound through the heart of the city, its waterfalls a source of civic pride. Downtown was thriving with department stores, movie theaters, and diners where teenagers gathered after school for milkshakes and jukebox music. The annual Lilac Festival brought the entire community together each spring. Father's Day had been invented there 49 years earlier, a testament to the city's strong family values. But beneath this Norman Rockwell painting of American life, something dark was lurking, and nobody saw it coming. The year 1959 sits at this fascinating crossroads in American history. Elvis Presley was king of rock and roll. The Soviet Union had just launched Sputnik, beginning the space race. Alaska and Hawaii became the 49th and 50th states. Fidel Castro took power in Cuba. The first Barbie doll went on sale. And in Spokane, Washington, a predator was walking the same streets as the children who trusted everyone they met. This is where Candy Rogers' story begins, not with her disappearance, but with the world that failed to protect her. Candy Rogers wasn't just a statistic waiting to happen. She was a real little girl with dreams, friendships, and a future that stretched out before her like an open road. Born in 1950, she came into a world still adjusting to peacetime. Her parents, Elaine and Carl Rogers, were like millions of other American couples trying to build a life in the post-war boom. They had one child, one precious daughter, and they poured everything into her. By all accounts, Candy was the kind of child that adults remember decades later. She had this laugh that would make you smile even if you were having the worst day. Teachers at Holmes Elementary School noted in her records that she was eager to learn, kind to other students, and had this natural warmth that drew people to her. She wasn't the most popular kid in her class, but she was universally liked, which in many ways is even more remarkable. Here's something that will become incredibly important later. Candy was a bluebird. For those of you too young to know what that means, the bluebirds were the youngest members of the Campfire Girls, kind of like Girl Scouts, but with a different focus. They learned outdoor skills, did community service, went on camping trips, and yes, they sold candy to raise funds for their activities. Candy loved being a bluebird. She wore her uniform with pride. She collected beads for her achievements. And she had a big sister in the program, a 10-year-old Campfire Girl who mentored her and included her in activities. Keep that detail in your mind. That big sister connection is going to matter more than anyone could have imagined. Now, Candy's home life wasn't perfect. Her parents had divorced, which in 1959 carried a heavy social stigma. Divorce was far less common than it would become in later decades, and families going through it often faced judgment from their community. Candy lived primarily with her mother, Elaine, who was a schoolteacher. As a single working mother in the 50s, Elaine faced challenges we can barely imagine today, but she was determined that Candy would have every opportunity to thrive. Carl Rogers, Candy's father, remained involved in her life despite the divorce. He loved his daughter fiercely. Remember his name, because his part in this story is one of the most heartbreaking elements of an already devastating case. Candy had a dog that she adored. Neighbors would see her playing with it in the yard, her laughter carrying down the street. She had friends she'd known since kindergarten. She had a bedroom filled with the books she loved to read. She had a life, a real life, full of small joys and future possibilities. On March 6, 1959, Candy Rogers was 9 years old. She was in 4th grade. She was healthy, happy, and looking forward to the weekend. In approximately 72 hours, she would be dead, and her family's nightmare would just be beginning. But let me tell you what actually happened that Friday, and why the details of that day would haunt investigators for the next 63 years. Friday, March 6, 1959, started like any other day. Candy woke up, got ready for school, ate breakfast with her mother, and headed off to Holmes Elementary. Nothing about that morning suggested that within hours, an entire city would be mobilized in the desperate search for a missing child. School ended at the usual time, around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Candy walked home along the route she'd traveled hundreds of times. She arrived at her house, dropped off her school things, and told her mother about her day. Everything was normal. Everything was safe. Then Candy mentioned that she wanted to go sell her campfire mints. She had 7 boxes of chocolate mints that her Bluebird troop was selling to raise money for their activities. This was a completely routine request. Candy had sold these mints before. Other children in the neighborhood were out doing the same thing that very afternoon. Elaine Rogers gave her permission but reminded her daughter of the rule that had been established long ago: be home before dark. It was a simple rule, one that Candy had never broken. There was no reason to think this time would be any different. Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Candy grabbed her 7 boxes of campfire mints, gave the family dog a quick pat, ate an oatmeal cookie as a snack, and walked out the front door into the spring afternoon. The sun was shining. Neighbors were in their yards. Other children were playing outside. The scene was so utterly normal that it should have been impossible for anything bad to happen. Multiple witnesses would later confirm seeing Candy walking through the neighborhood, clutching her boxes of mints, smiling and waving to people she recognized. She went door to door, made her sales pitch with the earnest enthusiasm of a 9-year-old trying to help her troop, and successfully sold at least 1 box. People who purchased mints from her that day would remember her cheerfulness, her polite thank yous, and the way she carefully counted out change. But somewhere between 4 o'clock and 5:30 that afternoon, something went terribly wrong. We don't know exactly when Candy encountered her killer. We don't know if she recognized him or if he was a stranger. We don't know if she was lured into a vehicle or grabbed off the street. We don't know if she screamed or if it happened so quickly that she had no chance to call for help. What we do know is this: at approximately 9 o'clock that evening, searchers found 6 boxes of campfire mints scattered across Pettit Drive, about a mile from Candy's home. The boxes appeared to have been dropped or thrown, but Candy had left home with 7 boxes. Where was the seventh box? That question would never be answered. Now, let me take you inside Elaine Rogers' mind during those first terrifying hours. She expected Candy home by 5:30 at the latest. When that time came and went with no sign of her daughter, Elaine started to worry. But worry at 5:30 is different than panic. Maybe Candy was at a friend's house. Maybe she'd lost track of time. Maybe she'd been so successful selling mints that she'd ventured farther than usual and just needed a few more minutes to get home. But when 6 o'clock came and Candy still hadn't returned, worry transformed into something darker. Elaine knew her daughter. Candy was responsible. Candy followed rules. Candy would never deliberately disobey, especially about something as important as coming home before dark. By 6:15, Elaine was making phone calls. First to Candy's grandfather, Stanley Newton, a well-known and respected member of the community. Then to friends. Then to neighbors. The word spread quickly. Candy Rogers hadn't come home. By 6:30, a small group of volunteers was already searching the neighborhood, knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen the little girl with the campfire mints. Many people had seen her earlier in the afternoon, but nobody had seen her recently. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. At 7 o'clock that evening, something happened that would become a strange footnote in this case. Candy's grandfather and his friends were searching near Pettit Drive when a car came speeding down the residential street at a dangerous velocity. The men had to jump out of the way to avoid being hit. At the time, it seemed like nothing more than a reckless driver. But years later, investigators would wonder, was that speeding car connected to Candy's disappearance? Was the driver fleeing the scene of a crime? Those questions would never be definitively answered. By the time full darkness fell on Spokane that Friday night, the search had grown to include dozens of volunteers and multiple police officers. They searched with flashlights, calling Candy's name, checking yards and garages and sheds. And that's when they found the boxes of mints on Pettit Drive. 6 boxes, not 7, and no sign of Candy anywhere. Elaine Rogers didn't sleep that night. How could she? Every creak of the house made her think it might be Candy coming home. Every car passing outside gave her a moment of hope that quickly dissolved into despair. She sat in the darkness, waiting, praying, and slowly beginning to accept the unthinkable possibility that her daughter might not be coming home at all. As dawn broke on Saturday, March 7, 1959, the search for Candy Rogers shifted into high gear. And what happened over the next 16 days would test the community's resolve in ways nobody could have predicted. By Saturday morning, the disappearance of Candy Rogers was front-page news across Spokane. Her photograph, that sweet image of a smiling 9-year-old girl, stared out from newspaper stands across the city. The headline was simple and devastating. Girl, 9, missing after selling candy. What happened next was remarkable. Spokane mobilized. We're not talking about a handful of concerned citizens. We're talking about hundreds, then thousands of people who dropped everything to search for a little girl most of them had never met. Store owners closed their businesses. Factory workers gave up their day off. Housewives left their homes. Teenagers skipped their weekend plans. They all showed up, ready to search, because a child was missing, and that meant everyone had a responsibility to help find her. The Spokane Police Department organized the volunteers into search teams, assigning each group specific areas to cover. Officers on horseback searched the rougher terrain. Patrol cars coordinated between search zones. Canine units were brought in to try to pick up Candy's scent. The Spokane River became a focal point. Its cold water and swift current represented one of the worst-case scenarios. Search teams walked along the banks, looking for any sign of the missing girl. Boats were deployed to search sections of the river that couldn't be accessed from shore. And then the military got involved. Fairchild Air Force Base, located just outside Spokane, provided a helicopter for aerial searches. This was a significant commitment of resources, but the base commander immediately approved it when he heard about the missing child. The helicopter was crewed by a pilot and 4 trained airmen who volunteered for the mission. They flew over the city and surrounding wilderness, their eyes scanning the ground below for any sign of Candy or her distinctive blue suede shoes or the bright boxes of mints she'd been carrying. The forests around Spokane were dense, with canopies so thick that ground searches could easily miss something that would be visible from above. But then tragedy struck, and it struck hard. On that Saturday afternoon, while flying over the Spokane River, the helicopter pilot failed to see a high-tension electrical wire. By the time he spotted it, it was too late to avoid it. The helicopter's rotor struck the wire with catastrophic force. The aircraft immediately lost control, spinning wildly as it plunged toward the river below. The crash killed 3 men instantly: Airman Merle D. Ray, Sergeant William A. McDonnell, and Lieutenant Kenneth G. Fatek. They were young men, servicemen who had volunteered to help search for a child they'd never met. They died in the cold waters of the Spokane River, their helicopter a twisted wreck, their mission incomplete. The news of the crash spread through the ranks of searchers like a shockwave. 3 men had given their lives trying to find Candy Rogers. 3 families would now be mourning their own losses. The search for one missing girl had now claimed 3 more victims. But here's what happened next, and this tells you everything you need to know about the people of Spokane in 1959. They didn't stop searching. If anything, the tragedy intensified their determination. Those 3 airmen couldn't have died in vain. Candy had to be found. The search continued with even greater urgency. Days passed, then a week, then 2 weeks, and still no sign of Candy. Elaine Rogers was deteriorating before everyone's eyes. She stopped eating. She stopped sleeping properly. She would sit by the window for hours, staring out at the street, waiting for Candy to come walking up to the house. Friends and family tried to care for her. But how do you comfort a mother whose child has vanished without a trace? Carl Rogers, Candy's father, was also consumed by the search. Despite the divorce, despite whatever had driven him and Elaine apart, his love for his daughter was absolute. He joined the search efforts every single day, refusing to give up hope even as the days stretched on with no answers. By the time 2 weeks had passed, the massive organized searches had begun to scale back. Not because people stopped caring, but because they had searched everywhere they could think of. Hundreds of square miles had been combed. Every lead had been followed. Every tip had been investigated. And still, nothing. The question haunting everyone was simple. Where was Candy Rogers? The answer came on March 22, 1959, 16 days after Candy had walked out her front door to sell mints. And it came from the most unexpected source imaginable. 2 airmen out hunting for woodchucks in a remote forest 7 miles from Candy's home. Howard Lawrence and Richard Bergen were just looking for a way to spend their Saturday afternoon. Both were stationed at Fairchild Air Force Base, the same base that had lost 3 men in the helicopter crash. They decided to go hunting for woodchucks in a remote wooded area east of the city. The location they chose was wild, rugged terrain. Dense pine forests, thick undergrowth, fallen logs everywhere. This wasn't a place where people went. There were no trails, no campsites, no reason for civilians to be out there. It was just wilderness. The 2 airmen made their way through the forest until they reached a small clearing. And that's where they saw something that made absolutely no sense. A small pair of blue suede shoes lying on the ground. Think about that for a moment. You're in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest house, and you find children's shoes. Your first thought isn't, oh, a child must have been here. Your first thought is, something is very, very wrong. Lawrence and Bergen stood there, staring at those shoes, and they immediately understood they had found something connected to Candy Rogers. The shoes were the right size for a 9-year-old. They were distinctive in style and color. And they were in a location where no child should ever be. They picked up the shoes and returned to base. Word spread quickly, and the shoes were turned over to the Spokane Police Department. Candy's grandfather was called in to identify them. When he saw those blue suede shoes, his worst fears were confirmed. They were Candy's. Now, put yourself in the investigator's shoes at this moment. You've been searching for 16 days. You've covered hundreds of square miles. You've followed countless leads that went nowhere. And suddenly, you have a concrete location to focus on, a clearing in the woods 7 miles from the girl's home. The search teams assembled at first light on Sunday, March 23rd. They converged on the area where the shoes had been found, fanning out in all directions from the clearing. They moved slowly, carefully, looking under every log, behind every tree, in every depression in the ground. And then one officer noticed something that didn't look quite right. A small mound of brush and pine needles. It looked almost natural, but something about it seemed deliberate, too carefully arranged to be random. He approached the mound and began carefully brushing away the debris. That's when he saw it. A knee, small and belonging to a child, sticking out from under the pile. What he found beneath that brush would haunt him for the rest of his life. Candy Rogers had been found, but the manner of her death, The way her body had been left there told a story of violence and evil that shattered whatever remained of Spokane's innocence. Her clothes were torn. Her ankles were bound together with a strip of cloth torn from her own clothing, and wrapped around her neck was another strip of fabric, tied in a way that made the cause of death immediately obvious even before the autopsy would confirm it. She had been strangled, but she had also been assaulted first. The autopsy would reveal the full extent of what had been done to her, details so disturbing that they were kept from the public out of respect for the Rogers family. When word reached Elaine Rogers that her daughter's body had been found, she collapsed. The sheer weight of the news, the certainty that Candy was dead and had died in such a horrible way, was more than her mind could process. She had to be sedated by a doctor, her consciousness mercifully blunted to spare her the full impact of her grief. More than 1,000 volunteers who had spent 16 days searching for Candy were devastated by the news. All that hope, all that effort, all those prayers, and this was the outcome. Not a happy reunion. Not a relieved child returned to her mother's arms. Just a small body under a pile of brush in the middle of nowhere. The community's grief was profound, but it quickly transformed into something else: rage. Someone had done this. Someone had taken an innocent child, violated her, killed her, and hidden her body in the woods like garbage. Someone was walking around Spokane, living their life, while Candy Rogers lay dead and her mother went insane with grief. Who was this person? How could they live with themselves? And most importantly, how were they going to be caught? Police Chief Clifford Payne made a promise to the media and the community. We'll put every available man on the case and keep them there till the thing is solved. We know what we're looking for now. We're looking for a maniac. The investigation launched with unprecedented intensity. Detectives worked around the clock. Every person who had seen Candy that afternoon was interviewed. Every resident of West Central Spokane was questioned. Every known offender in the area was brought in for interrogation. And there was one detail from the autopsy that gave investigators an intriguing lead: a purple smear on Candy's clothing that smelled distinctly like grape gum. That detail pointed them toward Hugh Byrne Morse, an imprisoned serial killer who was infamous for his love of grape-flavored gum. It was his signature, something investigators from multiple jurisdictions had noted about him. The purple grape gum found on Candy's body seemed too specific to be a coincidence. Morse was questioned extensively about Candy's murder, but he denied any involvement, and the timeline didn't work. According to prison records, he had been incarcerated at the time of Candy's disappearance and death. Unless those records were wrong, unless he had somehow escaped and returned without anyone noticing, he couldn't have killed Candy Rogers. Without physical evidence linking him to the crime, charges couldn't be filed. But Morse remained a prime suspect for years, the grape gum connection too strange to dismiss entirely. Beyond Morse, investigators chased hundreds of other leads. Tips poured in from across the city and even from other states. People reported suspicious vehicles, strange men talking to children, neighbors who acted oddly. Every single tip was investigated. Every lead was followed to its conclusion. But they all led nowhere. Months passed, then years. The case remained unsolved, a file that sat on detectives' desks, haunting them with its lack of answers. Candy was laid to rest in a cemetery in Spokane, her funeral attended by hundreds. Her small casket was lowered into the ground as her family wept, and Elaine Rogers had to face the reality that she would never see her daughter again. But the worst part? Her daughter's killer was still out there, living free, unpunished, unknown. In June 1963, for years after Candy's murder, Carl Rogers checked into a hotel in Walla Walla, Washington. He left behind a note expressing his love for Candy and his inability to continue living without her. Then he took his own life, another victim of the evil that had claimed his daughter. The grief had been too much. For years of not knowing, for years of watching the case go cold, for years of imagining his daughter's final moments, it had destroyed him from the inside out. Decades passed. Children who had been in elementary school when Candy was murdered grew up, graduated, got married, had children of their own. The world changed. The 50s became the 60s, then the 70s, 80s, 90s. Spokane grew and evolved. New cases came and went. But some detectives never forgot about Candy Rogers. Her file remained open in the cold case archives, pulled out periodically by new generations of investigators who hoped they might see something their predecessors had missed. In September 2006, Elaine Rogers passed away in her home at the age of 82. She died without ever knowing who had killed her daughter. She died without ever seeing justice. She died with those questions still tormenting her after 47 years. Both of Candy's parents were now gone, both destroyed in different ways by the same act of evil. And still, the case remained unsolved. It seemed like it would stay that way forever, like Candy's killer had literally gotten away with murder and taken his identity to the grave. But science was about to change everything. By the year 2001, something revolutionary had become available to law enforcement: forensic DNA analysis. This technology would have seemed like science fiction to the detectives who first investigated Candy's murder in 1959. But now it offered hope for cases that had seemed unsolvable for decades. Here's where Candy's case got incredibly lucky. Her clothing from when her body was found had been carefully preserved. Through decades of storage, through multiple moves of the evidence room, through technological changes and administrative turnover, someone had made sure that those clothes remained protected and cataloged. In 2001, those clothes were submitted to the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory. Using techniques that didn't exist in 1959, forensic scientists were able to extract DNA from biological material found on Candy's underwear. They created a DNA profile, a genetic fingerprint of the person who had killed Candy Rogers. This was huge. This was concrete scientific evidence. If they could match this profile to a person in the criminal DNA database, they would have their killer. The profile was uploaded to CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system. This database contained DNA profiles from convicted offenders across the United States. It had solved countless cold cases by matching crime scene DNA to known criminals. But there was no match for Candy's killer. Whoever he wasn't in the system. In 2002, detectives compared the DNA profile to Hugh Byron Morse, the serial killer who had been suspected for decades because of the grape gum. Finally, they could definitively rule him in or out. The result? Not a match. Morse wasn't Candy's killer. The grape gum had been nothing but a coincidence, a red herring that had consumed investigative resources for over 40 years. So the DNA profile sat in databases, waiting, compared periodically to new entries, but never producing a hit. The case returned to its cold status. But then, in 2017, something completely revolutionary emerged: forensic genetic genealogy. This technique combined DNA analysis with traditional genealogical research in a way that had never been done before. Instead of looking for exact matches in criminal databases, investigators could upload crime scene DNA to public genealogy websites where millions of people had voluntarily submitted their DNA to learn about their ancestry. The system would find partial matches, people who shared portions of their DNA with the unknown subject. These partial matches were relatives, siblings, cousins, second cousins, third cousins. By building family trees and working backward to common ancestors, then forward through the generations, investigators could identify suspects even if the suspects themselves had never submitted DNA anywhere. In April 2018, this technique was used to identify the Golden State Killer, a serial rapist and murderer who had terrorized California for decades. That case proved the incredible power of forensic genetic genealogy, and suddenly police departments across the country were looking at their cold cases with new hope. Brittany Wright, a forensic scientist with the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory Division, was assigned to revisit Candy's case using this new technique. She was determined to finally get answers for a family that had suffered for over 6 decades. She retrieved the DNA sample from the crime lab freezer where it had been stored since 2001. She reanalyzed it to confirm it matched the original profile. Then she ran diagnostic tests to see if the sample could be used for forensic genetic genealogy. The first lab she sent it to gave her devastating news. The DNA was too degraded. After decades of storage, even frozen storage, the genetic material had broken down too much to produce a genealogical profile. Brittany was crushed. So close, yet technological limitations were stopping them again. But a year later, she learned about Othram, a laboratory in Texas that specialized in working with degraded DNA that other labs had given up on. She contacted them, described the sample, and asked if they thought they could work with it. They said yes. They thought they had a chance. 6 months later, Othram came back with results that would finally, after 63 years, expose Candy Rogers' killer. 3 names: John Hoff, Andrew Hoff, and Terry Hoff. 3 brothers identified through forensic genetic genealogy as closely related to whoever had killed Candy Rogers. One of them was almost certainly the killer. But there was a problem. All 3 brothers were dead. They had passed away years earlier, which explained why their DNA had never appeared in any criminal database. Investigators now focused on John Hoff, the oldest of the 3 brothers. They discovered he had a daughter named Kathy who was still living. If they could get a DNA sample from Kathy and it matched the forensic profile, they would have statistical proof that John Hoff was Candy's killer. They reached out to Kathy, explaining that they were investigating her deceased father in connection with an old murder case. By that point, I had already looked up Little Girl Murdered in 1959, so I knew who it was, Kathy later said. She knew exactly what case they were talking about. Kathy agreed to provide a DNA sample. When the analysis came back, the results were stunning. It was 2.9 million times more likely that Kathy's DNA was related to the suspect profile than to the general population. In statistical terms, this was as close to certainty as science could provide. John Hoff was Candy Rogers' killer. But investigators wanted to know more. Who was this man? What had his life been like? Were there warning signs that had been missed? What they discovered painted a chilling picture. John Hoff had lived approximately 1 mile from Candy's home in 1959. He would have been familiar with the neighborhood, with the streets, with the community. In 1956, at age 17, he had enlisted in the army. But in 1961, 2 years after Candy's murder, John Hoff was arrested for attacking a woman in a manner that bore horrifying similarities to what had happened to Candy. He had forcibly removed the woman's clothes, used them to bind her hands and feet, and then attempted to strangle her with a piece of cloth wrapped around her neck. The parallels were unmistakable. The same method, the same pattern, the same sick ritual. The woman survived, fought back, or was rescued, and John Hoff was convicted and sent to prison. But he served only 6 months. 6 months for attempted murder. Then he was released back into society. The army dishonorably discharged him for being AWOL while incarcerated. After his release, John Hoff worked as a door-to-door salesman and in a lumber yard. To all outward appearances, he was just another working-class man trying to get by. But at age 31, John Hoff took his own life. He died in the early 1970s, taking his secrets to the grave, escaping any possibility of justice for what he had done to Candy Rogers. And here's the detail that makes this case even more disturbing. John Hoff's stepsister was Candy's big sister in the Campfire Girls program. That means John Hoff didn't randomly encounter Candy on the street. He knew her. He had seen her at his family's home. He knew she would be out selling mints that day. He may have even planned the whole thing, using his knowledge of Candy's activities to target her. This wasn't a crime of opportunity by a stranger. This was someone with access, someone with knowledge, someone who used that familiarity to gain her trust and destroy her life. Investigators decided to take one more step to achieve absolute certainty. With Kathy's permission and a court-authorized search warrant, they traveled to the cemetery where John Hoff was buried. They exhumed his remains, a process that required careful documentation and respect for proper procedures even when dealing with a suspected child killer. DNA was extracted from his teeth and bones, the parts of the body that preserve genetic material long after soft tissue has decomposed. The sample was sent for analysis and compared to the DNA profile from Candy's clothing. The result was definitive. John Hoff's DNA matched perfectly. He was, beyond any shadow of doubt, the person who had murdered Candy Rogers on March 6, 1959. After 63 years, the case was solved. "We got extremely lucky in that we got DNA from 1959, said former Spokane police detective Brian Hammond, who had worked on the case for years. They had no concept of that at the time, and that's obviously what cracks the case. Otherwise, I don't believe it would have ever been solved. The careful preservation of evidence through decades, combined with revolutionary advances in forensic science, had accomplished what seemed impossible. They had identified a killer who had died 50 years earlier, who had escaped all earthly punishment, who had taken his secrets to the grave. But science had reached back through time and exposed him anyway. Candy's surviving relatives were contacted and informed about the breakthrough. 77-year-old Joan Poss, Candy's cousin, told the media. It's not closure, but at least there's some form of satisfaction knowing that the person that did it is at least named. He may be in a grave, but he's named. But there was profound sadness too. They never saw him pay or die for it, or whatever, Joan said, referring to Candy's grandparents and parents. They went to their grave not knowing, and that was hard. Elaine Rogers had died in 2006 without ever learning who killed her daughter. Carl Rogers had taken his own life in 1963, destroyed by grief and unanswered questions. Stanley Newton, Candy's grandfather who had searched for her so desperately, had died in the 1970s never knowing the truth. All the people who had loved Candy most, who had needed answers most desperately, had died without ever receiving them. For Kathy Hoff, learning that her father was a child killer was devastating in ways most people can't imagine. John Hoff had died when she was 9 years old, the same age Candy had been when she was murdered. It's just really sad to find out that someone, not even just your dad, but someone in your family, could do something like that, Kathy said. She had grown up believing her father's suicide was the result of depression. And now I think, no, he was evil. It wasn't an escape and away from it. But he got to die with people thinking he was an upstanding man, and he wasn't. Kathy publicly apologized for her father's crime. I'm very, very sorry for what my dad did, that he took her life horribly. I hope that it gives peace knowing that even though it's not really justice because he doesn't get any punishment, his name has this on it now, and they can know it's solved. And that's the bitter reality of this case. John Hoff never faced trial. He never had to look Elaine Rogers in the eye and explain why he killed her daughter. He never had to answer for attacking that woman in 1961, a crime that clearly showed he was dangerous and should have led investigators back to examine him for Candy's murder. He lived for 12 years after killing Candy Rogers. Then he died on his own terms, escaping all consequences, taking his secrets with him. But 63 years later, those secrets were exposed anyway. His name is now permanently associated with one of the most notorious child murders in Washington state history. His grave bears the marker of a killer. Anyone researching their family tree who discovers John Hoff in their lineage will learn what he did. That's not justice in the traditional sense. But it's something. It's truth. It's exposure. It's a final accounting, even if it came far too late. Even with John Hoff identified as Candy's killer, questions remain that will never be answered. Was this attack premeditated? The connection through his stepsister suggests he knew Candy would be selling mints that day. Did he plan this in advance? Or did he see an opportunity and act on impulse? Were there other victims? John Hoff clearly had a pattern. Candy in 1959, the woman he attacked in 1961. Same method, same ritual, same sick behavior. What happened in the 12 years between that attack and his suicide? Did he stop? Did he get better at not being caught? Are there other families out there still wondering what happened to their loved ones? Why did he receive only 6 months in prison for attempting to murder a woman in 1961? That light sentence meant he was back on the streets quickly, free to potentially harm others. For the Rogers family, the resolution of Candy's case brought complicated emotions. Relief at finally knowing the truth. Anger that it took so long. Sadness that those who needed answers most never received them. And a strange, painful gratitude that at least now, after all these years, Candy's killer has been named and his crimes exposed. The neighborhood where Candy lived has changed dramatically. The houses are older, many have been renovated or replaced. The families who lived there in 1959 have moved away or passed on. But there are still people in West Central Spokane who remember that Friday in March when everything changed, when the illusion of safety was shattered, when a community learned that evil could strike anywhere, even in broad daylight on a residential street. Campfire Girls, the organization Candy belonged to, has undergone various changes over the decades. Safety protocols for youth organizations were significantly strengthened after her murder and similar tragedies. The idea of young children going door to door alone to sell anything is now considered unthinkably dangerous. What seemed innocent in 1959 is recognized today as a vulnerability that predators can exploit. Candy's grave in Spokane is still visited regularly. Flowers are left. Notes are placed at the headstone. People who have learned her story stop by to pay their respects to a little girl they never knew, but whose death touched them deeply. Her case reminds us that behind every cold case statistic is a real person, a real family, and real suffering that doesn't diminish with time. Every victim deserves to have their story told and their killer identified, no matter how many years have passed. The Candy Rogers case isn't just about one murdered child and one identified killer. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about justice, punishment, and the limits of the legal system. John Hoff got away with murder. That's just a fact. He killed Candy Rogers, lived for 12 more years, and died on his own terms without ever facing legal consequences for his crime. The attack in 1961 that should have flagged him as a suspect in Candy's murder resulted in only 6 months in prison. The system failed spectacularly. Some would argue that his suicide at age 31 was its own form of punishment, that the guilt of what he'd done ultimately drove him to take his own life. But that's speculation. We have no evidence that John Hoff felt any guilt at all. He might have killed himself for completely unrelated reasons. We'll never know. What we do know is that proper investigation and prosecution in 1961 could have solved Candy's case, while both her parents were still alive. The similarities between that attack and Candy's murder should have been investigated. The fact that nobody made that connection represents a failure of law enforcement that had devastating consequences for the Rogers family. The case also raises questions about how we handle dangerous individuals. John Hoff demonstrated clear predatory behavior. He attacked 2 people we know about using the same method. How many others might there have been? And if he had been properly identified and imprisoned after Candy's murder or the 1961 attack, how many potential future victims might have been spared? These aren't just theoretical questions. They're about real people, real potential victims, real families who might have been spared the kind of suffering the Rogers family endured. There's also the question of closure. Does identifying a killer 63 years after the crime really provide closure when everyone who loved the victim is dead? Does it matter that John Hoff has been named as Candy's killer when he can never be punished, when Elaine Rogers never got to see justice, when Carl Rogers took his own life not knowing who killed his daughter? These questions don't have easy answers. But I'd argue that yes, it matters. Truth matters even when it comes too late. Identifying killers matters even when traditional justice is impossible. Solving cold cases matters because it tells victims and their families that they haven't been forgotten, that someone still cares about finding answers, that their lives mattered enough to keep searching for decades. If you've made it this far, you've spent significant time learning about Candy Rogers, her family, her murder, and the incredible journey to finally identify her killer 63 years after her death. What should we take away from this case? First, evil is real and it walks among us in ordinary disguises. John Hoff wasn't a Hollywood monster. He was a working-class man who lived in a normal neighborhood, held normal jobs, and probably seemed completely unremarkable to most people who knew him. But underneath that ordinary exterior was someone capable of murdering a child. The scariest monsters are the ones who look like everyone else. Second, preservation of evidence matters more than we can possibly imagine at the time. The detectives who carefully stored Candy's clothing in 1959 had no concept of DNA analysis. They couldn't have predicted that 6 decades later, microscopic genetic material would solve the case. But they preserved the evidence anyway, and that decision ultimately brought justice. Third, families of victims never stop suffering. It doesn't matter if it's been 1 year or 60 years. Elaine Rogers died without answers after 47 years of torment. Carl Rogers couldn't survive 4 years of not knowing. The pain doesn't fade. The questions don't stop haunting you. Every cold case represents a family still suffering, still waiting, still hoping for answers that might never come. Fourth, science is incredible. The fact that we can now reach back through time, extract DNA from 60-year-old evidence, compare it to public genealogy databases, build family trees, and identify killers who died decades ago. That's almost like magic. It's human ingenuity and determination combined with technological advancement to achieve something that would have seemed impossible just a generation ago. Fifth, justice delayed is still justice, even if it's not the justice we wish we could have. Yes, John Hoff escaped legal punishment. Yes, he died before he could be arrested, tried, and imprisoned. But his name is now forever associated with the murder of Candy Rogers. His crimes have been exposed. His daughter and anyone else connected to him now knows what he was. That's not nothing. And finally, we must never stop fighting for victims, no matter how much time has passed. The detectives who worked on Candy's case across multiple generations never gave up. They kept trying new techniques, following new leads, and hoping that somehow, someday, they would get answers. And because they refused to give up, Candy Rogers' case was finally solved. There are thousands of cold cases out there right now. Thousands of families still waiting for answers. Thousands of victims who deserve to have their killers identified and their stories told. Cases like Candy's prove that it's never too late to find the truth. Before I close this investigation, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below answering these questions. Do you think forensic genetic genealogy raises legitimate privacy concerns? Or do you believe solving murders justifies accessing public DNA databases? Is there value in solving cold cases after all the victims' family members have died? Or is it just an academic exercise at that point? What do you think should have been done differently in this case that might have led to solving it sooner? And most importantly, if you learned something from this deep dive into the Candy Rogers case, please hit that like button, share this video with others who appreciate thorough true crime coverage, and subscribe to Buried Secret Media for more investigations into cases that deserve to be remembered. Candy Rogers was 9 years old when she was murdered on March 6, 1959. She deserved to grow up, to have a future, to live a full life. She deserved justice in a timely manner. Her family deserved answers while they were still alive to receive them. We can't change the past. We can't bring Candy back. We can't give Elaine and Carl Rogers the closure they deserved. But we can remember. We can tell Candy's story. We can honor the 3 airmen who died searching for her. We can celebrate the detectives who never gave up. And we can ensure that cases like this continue to be investigated, that victims are never forgotten, and that the pursuit of justice never ends, no matter how many decades may pass. Rest in peace, Candy Rogers. Your story has been told. Your killer has been named. You are remembered. This has been a Buried Secret Media investigation. Thank you for watching. And remember, the truth always finds a way to surface, even when it takes 63 years. Until next time, keep questioning, keep seeking truth, and never stop fighting for justice.